Hey, welcome to Chapter 2. We will be learning the chemical basis of life here. So a lot of important things to learn here, kind of covering what we've referenced in Part 1 of Chapter 1. So really focusing on atoms and chemicals and what are the important chemicals for life. So when you're thinking about life itself, what are the common atomic elements of biology? Think about that for a moment and maybe answer it in your head. Well, the four most common ones are hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, right? And of course, phosphorus and sulfur, which, the background image kind of gave you a hint there. But these are the common ones. We are carbon-based life forms, right? So we're surrounded and based upon carbon, which forms four bonds with other atomic elements. So we're not silicon-based. Of course, tons of sci-fi. I'm a big sci-fi reader, so read Dune. It's a great book. Movies are great, but the Dune book is even better. But we are carbon-based life forms, right? Require all of these elements. There are other ones, phosphorus, sulfur, but there's also fluorine, sodium, magnesium, calcium, chlorine, potassium, iron, iodine. There are traces of uranium in us, so you can, depending upon how small you want to get, even mercury's in us that's required. You can find a lot of the elements in us, but in terms of large trace elements that we need for life, these are the ones that we need. Right? So atomic structure, the textbook has a lot of chemistry in this chapter. What I'm covering in this PowerPoint is what I want you guys to know. So do not be concerned about all of the craziness that you'll see in Chapter 2. I'm trying to condense down the important information you need to know as nurses. So atoms, right, are composed of neutrons, protons, electrons, based upon the charges. Right? Neutrons have no electrical charge, so not negative and not positive. It's just neutral. You have protons, which have a positive charge, so those are the optimists of the atom, subatomic particles. And you have your electrons, which are negatively charged, which they are the pessimists in this family here. So when we talk about, this is important because when we talk about like ions and neuronal signals, electrochemical signals, there will be positive and negative charges on like calcium, chlorine, and so forth that are important for both signaling, muscle function, neuronal function. So that's why we care about positive charge versus negative charge based upon number of protons and electrons, right? So the nucleus of the atom is formed by protons and neutrons coming together, right? And most of these are covered by an electron cloud unless you are hydrogen and you don't have your electron cloud, and then you're just basically a glorified proton at that point. But there's always electron cloud around all these atoms, right? Depending upon the size of the molecule, you can have one to many electrons surrounding the atomic core, the nucleus, right? So because of that, we have an atomic number, which is more related to the number of protons in each atom, which should be related to the number of electrons. Sometimes they're not true. That's when we have isotopes. And we're not really going to be concerned with that too much, but there's no absolutes. That my statement is there's no absolutes in biology. No absolutes in chemistry either. So especially when you get in physics and math, there's no absolutes. There's just generalized truths and statements that we make. So for you guys, this is what you again need to know. Mass numbers, the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, right? If you go into radiology, there's more that you need to know in terms of, atomic number and mass and so forth, but this is the general idea. Inside of this, what you guys really want to focus on is like our bond types, right? So when we talk about bonds, there's multiple different types of bonds or ways that atoms are attracted to one another and basically stay tight. I don't know. Without saying the word bonds and getting redundant, other ways of saying that, but, atoms attached to other atoms, how do they hold that connection? Well, there's different ways of doing that. Well, this is formed around the fact that atoms have an outer shell of electrons that make these connections, right? This is called the valence shell. And these electrons are either shared with other atoms or they are transferred from one atom to another. And that's really dictating the type of bond. So in an ionic bond, electrons are transferred from one atom to another. Like sodium chloride, table salt. That's an ionic bond because the chlorine ion really takes the electron away from the sodium. Covalent bonding, on the other hand, is where the atoms share these electrons in their valence shell. The electron moves freely between one atom and another. And this is all to get the goal of having an octet or 8 electrons in that outer shell. That octet, it's a chemical thing, it's physics, it's math, it's just the basis of chemical bonding. You just need to know it. You guys probably had chemistry back in high school. You don't need chemistry for your nursing degree, so we're not going to get too concerned with understanding particle physics or other deeper chemical understandings, but to form a covalent bond, you're always trying to maintain 8 electrons in that outer shell, right? And that's also true for ionic bonds, but especially in covalent bonding. So an example here of ionic bonds, like table salt, sodium chloride. Sodium has an extra electron in its valence shell, right? It loses that to the chlorine, right? So now the sodium becomes positively charged because now it has more protons than electrons, and the chloride ion now has more electrons than protons, so now it's negatively charged, right? And chlorine now has 8 electrons in its valence shell versus the sodium doesn't. So this kind of positive-negative charge creates a bonding kind of in the form of a way of a magnet, right? That negative oppositely charged particle state attracts these two atoms together to form this bond type. It can be a very strong bond, mainly from the fact that they're very organized, because you want that each atom wants to touch as many other atoms in the bond structure as possible, so it's highly organized. Hence why we get crystals from ionic bonds, right? And here's some example of important ions in the body. We're not getting too bogged down here with it. Calcium, sodium, potassium, hydrogen, hydroxide, chloride, bicarbonate, ammonium, phosphate, iron, magnesium, iodide, right? All of these things are ions in the human body. And if you notice, some of them are even chemical ions, right? That's just the nature of the bonds. So ions are important to the human body, especially when we get into neuronal function and muscle function. We care about them. Now, covalent bonds, on the other hand, hold everything together. So we don't really have an example of like a covalent bond is required for a function of life because it makes life. So it's the type of bond that we find in all of our biomolecules holding those biomolecules together. So proteins, DNA, carbohydrates, so forth and so on. They form covalent bonds to make those structures, those chemicals, right? So a single covalent bond is where two atoms share one pair of electrons, right? So you're trying to remember, go back to the octet to form 8 electrons. So you have like 7 electrons in one atom, 7 in another. You share them at different times. One has 8, one has 6, and then it goes back and forth. It's quantum physics is crazy, okay? But either way, they share their electrons. You can have a double covalent bond, is where you share a total of 2 atoms, share 4 electrons, right? Then you have nonpolar covalent bonds, is where you have these electrons are shared equally. So you will, statistically speaking, find electrons equally distributed between both atoms that are forming this bond. Polar covalent bonds are where you would find the electrons not equally shared. So you would find the electron hanging out with one atom more than the other. Again, it's quantum physics, don't need to go into. But this polar, non-polar is actually quite important, more than I think than the single and the double for you guys, covalent bonds, because these are types of covalent bonds. And they actually dictate bodily functions and chemical functions vital for life, right? So you maybe try to think of an example of like a non-polar covalent bond molecule that's vital for us. And hint, it makes up 70% of who you are by mass. So polar and non-polar, right? So hydrogen ion atom, I say ion, it's hydrogen atom is a unique little dude. But it can share, right, one pair of electrons with another, or a certain electron with another atom molecule. So now you have a fully filled valence shell of 2 here, that's what hydrogen does. And the electrons are shared equally, so they're non-polar. You can't discern one end from the other, is what that polar and non-polar means. So non-polar means there's no positive, negative charge detected, right? So this red kind of indicates where you would find the most of the electrons. It's in the middle. They're sharing like perfect siblings, which we all have. Polar, on the other hand, the electrons are not being shared equally, right? So where the electrons you would find mostly in around the core of another one. So it's the one atom is pulling or unequally taking away from another one. They're still sharing, but it's like a bigger sibling taking the toy away from a younger sibling, right? They're just bigger and stronger, can hold the toy longer until mom and dad come in and, equal it all out, right? So you would find, therefore, most of the electrons surrounding one atom versus another. And then what's the example of a polar molecule? It's in this figure. Anyone? You're right. It's water, right? Water is a polar molecule where hydrogen's electrons are predominantly found around the oxygen, right? And that provides a lot of processes for life. Hint, DNA, double helix, hydrogen bonding, right? This is actually coming up in the next slide here. So this will be the last slide in this part 1. So there are forces or bonds you could view that are formed by atoms or molecules that are formed by electrons not being shared, right? There is no transfer of electrons whatsoever in these intermolecular forces, right? The electrons are staying with the molecule that it's in, but as the result of this polarity or this polar covalent bonding, or even ionic bonding, there's this positive and negative effect, right? Like a magnet, that attracts one molecule to another, forming a type of bond. One of the most important examples of this intermolecular force is hydrogen bonds, where the hydrogen in the water molecule is positively charged, and it's attracted to the more negatively charged oxygen in another water molecule, right? So this actually is a very important bond in life, especially in terms of DNA double helix bond formation, right? There's other examples. It doesn't have to be oxygen to hydrogen. It's just basically any negatively charged atom, such as nitrogen, bonded and attracted to a positively charged hydrogen, hence the hydrogen bond title, right? So this is really important to understand. We'll probably hit this in class in person for a little bit so you understand the importance of it. But these are the three types of bonds that are important. So we'll end this video here and move into some more chemical stuff later.